We will end our programming tonight with a final series of Imagining the Future, Resetting Our Financial World, moderated by the CEO of Dynamic Planet, Kristin Rechberger.
Thanks for joining us, David. David is CEO of Verra. David, carbon offsets have received a lot of attention lately. Verra has been involved in carbon markets for a long time. Can you please tell us about Verra's role and the status of the carbon market?
Sure. Thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation. It's an honor to be here. So Verra is a nonprofit organization, and we sit in a very unique position at the center, really at the confluence of finance and climate action. And we do that by serving as a regulator. Traditionally, that's been in what's called the voluntary carbon market. And it means that we manage and set rules and requirements around what qualifies as a real project that can generate carbon offsets. We manage the Verified Carbon Standard Program, or the VCS program, which is the largest greenhouse gas credit program in the voluntary carbon market in the world.
Some would say that offsets don't really solve the root problem. What's your response to that?
Well, they do not solve the root problem, but that's because they're not meant to do so. So offsets are really meant to compensate what you would call residual emissions that you cannot avoid. So, they're really meant to complement more comprehensive and deeper actions to address climate change. Let me give you an analogy. When you brush your teeth at night, you get rid of most of the stuff in your mouth, but you don't get rid of everything. But there comes flossing, right? So just like flossing, carbon offsetting can serve to complement and really kind of clean up the rest of the mess. And unfortunately, the reality is that no matter what we do, we're going to have residual emissions, and that's where offsetting comes in. And it's important to note one thing, that offsetting is getting a lot of attention because it is very effective at doing what it's meant to do, meaning it's reducing emissions. And that's because there are rigorous rules around offsets. They're audited by independent third parties. The information is all publicly available on websites, and they're managed by nonprofits. It's not a profit-driven thing. So they're very effective at what they do, but they're not meant to solve the problem. And it's important that we understand the difference between the two.
Yeah, a lot of companies are making big carbon announcements lately. Like Microsoft, for example, wants to be carbon negative by 2030, which means they have to offset, reduce, and invest in things like nature-based solutions, reforestation, or keeping wetlands in place. Why are some companies doing this now?
Well, I think they're seeing the risks behind not taking any action, and they're seeing opportunities to really be leaders. So kudos to Microsoft for taking that commitment and making all that happen. They're doing, I believe, what they can to reduce their own emissions, and they're offsetting what they can. And they're also investing in other new technologies that might help us solve the problem. But this really kind of is a all hands on deck kind of a problem where we need all of the solutions. At the same time, my guess is that Microsoft is making a bet or understands that at some point, consumers are going to be asking, where were you when this was a looming crisis? Were you doing the right thing? Were you taking action? And were you being responsible with your emissions?
The big companies represent the demand side of the carbon market. Let's move to the supply side. Can you give a couple of carbon offset project examples and how that financing has helped nature and communities in that place?
Sure, absolutely. There's quite a few. We've registered more than 1,500 projects, so there's quite a few to talk about. But I'll talk about two that do two things. One, they address climate, so they're reducing greenhouse gas emissions or sequestering carbon from the atmosphere, but they're also generating a lot of sustainable development benefits. The first project is in Indonesia. It's called the Rimba Raya project. It took 91,000 of natural, tropical virgin forest and prevented it from becoming a palm oil plantation. And that area is now becoming a reserve for orangutans to be reintroduced to the wild. At the same time, the project is providing technical and business support to people and the communities to provide for food production ventures. So that enhances food security, increases income, and does a lot of good, in addition to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. In a separate different project in Kenya, the TIS project, it's paying farmers money for planting and growing trees. They're working with more than 90,000 farmers in Kenya alone. And, the farmers have responsibility for growing the trees and measuring and reporting all the carbon that they've sequestered, but that they can also do what they want with the revenues. One woman, for example, built a school and now has a side business running a school for local children. An interesting feature about this particular project is really interesting. They have a rule that in the smaller farmer groups that they organize between 50 and 80 people, you can't repeat being a leader until every adult that's eligible to become a leader has played a role, has become a leader, has been a leader in the group. So it means that people who've traditionally not typically been leaders, they've been able to step up. And of course, women, you can imagine, are now taking leadership roles in their communities and doing a fantastic job. So these are just two examples of projects that are doing a tremendous amount of good, both to address the climate problem, but also to provide sustainable development benefits to communities and people.
Very cool. What can we as individuals do to reduce our carbon footprints?
Well, I think that it takes us back to the flossing example, right? I think we can do some fundamental changes. We can put solar panels on our roof. We can commit to buying renewable electricity. We can fly a lot less. We can eat less meat. There's a number of things we can do, and we should be doing. We also can offset what we can't avoid, right? But I think the question is interesting because we've got to make sure that ultimately it's not, we need to do things, but also our governments need to do things too. And they need to lead the process to ensure that we have systemic change from the ground up. And that means electing leaders who believe in climate change. So that's a really important part. What we can do is, let's say, vote for people who care about climate change.
Great. And during this time of turbulence, David, what are you optimistic about?
I'd say three things. The first relates to my last point, that I think climate change is becoming a real serious issue, a hot topic, and will drive much of the debate in upcoming election cycles, whether in the US or around the world. We're seeing a massive movement with Greta and a lot of real attention and focus on this issue. I'm hopeful that we'll have real governments who are very committed to taking on serious action on this real big problem that's a looming crisis. I think the second thing relates to the Paris Agreement, which is the mechanism or the framework we've all agreed to address climate change. And one of the interesting parts about the Paris Agreement is that it enables countries to step up and have greater ambition. So if we have politicians who care about climate change, when they come to realizing or submitting, their targets in the future, those will be more stringent. And I hope, and I'm optimistic about the fact that we'll be able to, see increased ambition. And finally, I'm heartened by, the actions that people are taking already, and that some of the corporates that we've seen, you mentioned Microsoft just a few days ago, Delta made a terrific announcement about how they're doubling down on their sustainability commitment, even in the face of this massive crisis that's certainly making an impact on their bottom line. So I'm hopeful that people will not lose sight of the real one of the very important issues of our time, and that we need to get on top of it.
Thanks so much for joining us, David.